Several years ago when we had the DSLR revolution, cameras like the 5D Mark II and the Canon T2i meant that large sensors were affordable for everyone, and as a result of that, everyone could get shallow depth of field. In a previous video I've explained how having a larger sensor in a camera contributes to having a shallower depth of field. You started to see more lower budget work with shallow depth of field all over the internet. This was good for everyone who wanted to increase their cinematic capabilities, but after a while shallow depth of field started to be described as overused and cheap. In some situations, people actually described shallow depth of field as a low budget look, but I don't think blaming the depth of field is very reasonable. Let me explain. This is a bad shot. The subject isn't very interesting, the framing is off, the lighting's not very good, and it has a shallow depth of field. Getting a shallow depth of field doesn't require much skill. If you have a large censored camera, a long lens with a reasonably fast aperture, and you put your subject fairly close to the lens, you will get a shallow depth of field. But the depth of field isn't what's making this shot bad. It's all the other things that I mentioned that are making this shot bad. If anything, the shallow depth of field takes this shot from awful to not very good, which is still not what you want, but it's better than awful. If anything, the shallow depth of field actually saves this shot. Here is another example. This is a better shot. It's not going to win an Oscar for cinematography, but I'm at home and I have a deadline, so it's good enough. The lighting and composition are better and the subject is more interesting, but it doesn't have a shallow depth of field. If we open up the aperture a bit on the lens, then this shot has a shallow depth of field. But the shot was alright before. And that's my point. A shallow depth of field should enhance the image. It shouldn't be the reason why your image is good. If a video has lots of shallow depth of field shots and it looks amateurish and awful, it's probably not the depth of field, it's going to be everything else. The depth of field is just something that's easy to draw attention to, but it's not actually the problem. So if you want to use a shallow depth of field, then just go ahead and go for it. That doesn't mean you should always use as much as possible. If you're going to be doing an interview with someone and they're going to be maybe moving around a bit, rocking backwards and forwards, you don't need a 3mm thick focal plane. That's just taking it too far. So now that we've established shallow depth of field is something that's good and you shouldn't be afraid to use it, moving on to the next related topic, is full frame overrated? Specifically in terms of depth of field. This also applies to APS-C cameras such as Super 35, but they're more generally accepted. It's, do you need full frame, which is the bigger question. As I talked about in a previous video, one of the advantages of a larger sensor is more depth of field. Now, in an ideal situation with ideal shooting conditions, basically any camera can get depth of field, but it gets interesting when you're not in ideal shooting situations. If you're shooting short films or feature films with a bit of a budget, then you're okay because you've got time and the resources to set up shots that work to the strengths and weaknesses of your camera. But if you're filming something low budget and you're working faster, or if you're filming an event, you can't always set up the perfect shot in order to get some nice shallow depth of field. If you have a decently sized sensor like APS-C or full frame, then you can get a good shallow depth of field without needing a lens at f1.8. You don't find that many zoom lenses at f1.8, and the ones that you do find don't tend to have a massive zoom range or image stabilization, and both of those things do help you to move faster and get good usable shots quickly. You also don't have to be as close to your subject, which is one of the factors that determines depth of field. After all, if you're filming something that's moving quickly, if you don't have to run after them, you can just stay where you are, zoom in, and still get a nice looking shot. That really is ideal. So after all this, we've established that having a nice shallow depth of field isn't a bad thing. Just don't overuse it. You don't always have to have a razor-thin focal plane all of the time. Next time you're watching a film, have a look at the background. Most of the time you'll notice that it is a bit out of focus, so that in the frame there's more attention on the subject. But you'll also notice that it's not normally so blurry that there's just a bunch of abstract shapes floating around either. This is why a lot of cinematography is done between f2.8 and f5.6. You get a bit of shallow depth of field, but not too much. If you found this video useful, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.